14.
Alright, you two. Enough warming up.
Daphne began, standing off to the side.
I want to see what you can do, but as an added challenge, I want both of you to not use your strongest element directly. Get inventive. I want to make sure you two are prepared for what's coming.
Chesney and Medea nodded, not taking their eyes off each other, then took their own battle-ready stances. Not long after they had woken up, Daphne's attendants made breakfast for them all, and they had a long talk about their journey thus far. After hearing in detail what they had faced on their journey, Daphne explained she wouldn't send them off without making sure they were ready. And so, she suggested a battle between the two of them. I think this is just the push you both need to really expand your horizons, and to find a newfound respect for yourselves and each other. Destry and Slayer were standing with Daphne, watching them both with curious expressions. Chesney looked over at Medea. She was standing there, eyes closed, concentrating. The light of So's dawn was only just above the eastern mountains. The air was filled with morning mist. Her hair almost shimmered as it gathered the early dew. She was beautiful, but her posture was utter seriousness and deadly. He shook his head to focus and thought of what his first move and priority should be. Medea is a lot more practiced at spiritualism and the tactics of combat in general, but she can't bring the physical force that I can. She must know that if I get in close, she's done for. So, she will focus on keeping her distance and peppering me with magic. So, I need to focus on closing the distance quickly. Across the grove, Medea too focused on what she needed to prioritize in the coming fight. She pictured Chesney in her mind, tried to look over him critically and see the flaws in his fighting style. Chesney's main strength is that he is strong, determined, and adaptable. But his biggest problem is that he can get frustrated easily. If I can turn his attacks away enough, he will get too flustered and begin to make mistakes. And when he does, I need to take him out with a single attack, or he will turn things around and wear me out.
Hey, Con, quit just standing there. Let's see some action.
Destry laughed, elbowing Slayer. Slayer just grunted, eyeing both combatants evenly. Daphne groaned.
We don't need comments from the peanut gallery, so shut up, you whippersnapper.
Then she turned again to the children.
Alright, now, on 3. 1, 2, 3.
On 3. Medea's eyes snapped open. With one hand, she touched her chest, hand aglow with a spell, and with the other, she brought up her staff in a defensive posture. Chesney began to dash towards her, sword in hand, and also touched his chest with the spell. In the blink of an eye, his footsteps doubled in speed, and he launched at her with his blade in a wide horizontal slash. With incredible speed, she brought her staff into the exact right spot to block the attack. The blow was strong, though, and knocked the staff from her hand.
Well, better luck next time, Medea,
he crowed, turning his sword to slash at her with the flat of his blade to quickly end the fight. However, she instead said,
Freeze!
And then he felt his body slow to a crawl, and then stop. He had never felt what it was like to be on the other side of the spell before, but it was the strangest sensation. In the blink of an eye, he was knocked back, soaring through the air, feeling as though he had been kicked in several places. He cried out in pain and rolled in the grass with his sword lying beside him. Growling, he grabbed a hold of it and bolted upright, staring her down. She smiled sweetly at him and said,
Better luck next time,
while idly twirling the staff in her fingers. Destry laughed.
Oh wow, she played you good, Chesney.
Slayer grunted.
Stay focused, kid.
Chesney didn't allow them to interfere with his thoughts. Fine. You want to play it like that? You can't use lightning, but I can. But what else did you do when I was frozen? I need to surprise you with something suboptimal, or you will have thought of it already, and planned accordingly. Chesney changed stances, held two fingers in front of his face, and sparks began to form. Medea, in response, began to run in a wide circle around him. She kept an eye on him, and sometimes changed her pace or zigged or zagged to mess with his targeting. He caught sight of her face, and saw the glint of a smirk there. I knew it, he thought. She put on the reflective wall while I couldn't see. She wants me to try to zap her from a distance, then take the hit. He began to point his fingers at her and track her running. He played up the lightning, getting stronger in his hand, but he had no intention of releasing it. Instead, with his other hand, he flung his sword and sent it spinning at her feet. Surprised, she stumbled, and was unable to decide how to react, both trying to leap out of the way, timing it wrong, and trying to recover using her staff. This, of course, left her wide open, so he took the opportunity to dash to where she was stumbling, and hit her with a body check that sent her flying into the ground without her staff. She coughed and spluttered, trying to regain her breath while he casually walked over to his sword and kicked her staff further away. Destry whistled.
Ooh, nice one. I'm legitimately impressed.
Damn, she thought. He figured that one out. I need to get him off balance. I need to make him think he's won, and then use my last gambit. While she looked like she was still struggling to get up, she pressed her hand to her chest once more, with a new spell, while he casually walked over.
Will you surrender already?
He asked, caught somewhere between annoyed and proud, leveling his sword at her.
You first,
she shouted, suddenly twirling her legs in the air to launch breaking waves of reality from her feet, simultaneously attacking, and using the momentum to flip upright and land on her feet. He was far too close to dodge it, and when it collided with his chest he felt something like a tidal wave inside, pulling his organs and making him sick to his stomach, and his heart skip a beat. He didn't let it stop his advance, though, and managed to hit Medea's side with the edge of his sword as she dashed around him to try to reach her staff. She cried out in pain, and stumbled again, clutching her side and feeling blood begin to flow. The lead she had hoped to gain on him had narrowed considerably. Both their eyes were on her staff, a few dozen yards away. They both raced for it, Chetsney gaining an inch with every step, his gait just that much wider than hers. I don't have time to get to the staff before he'll catch me, which means I need to surprise him now, or it's over. It better be enough, she thought. The staff was tantalizingly close, and then Medea made to look like she was diving for the staff. In response, Chetsney leapt in the air, arms wide, ready to pin her as soon as she grabbed it. Instead, she stopped hard, planting both feet in the ground, thrust out both fists aimed right at his stomach. With Chetsney in the air, there was no way to adjust, and the blow landed solidly. Chetsney felt like he had been struck by a boulder. She managed to stop his momentum completely, and so the full force of his own momentum and her own strength poured into him. How could she be this strong? His mind flashed back to the previous day.
Medea, what happens when you combine earth with sky?
He asked, suddenly remembering that the spirits at Medea's disposal were slightly different than his own.
Well, that's interesting, actually. It's a power that charges a person with more power than they should normally be able to handle. Almost super strength.
He collapsed to his knees, clutching his stomach, the wind knocked out of him completely, utterly paralyzed by the ferocity of the blow. Medea staggered back as well, arms and legs trembling from the unaccustomed force she had just used through them. Please, be enough, she begged. She was utterly spent. The running, the dodging, magic, and blows she had taken had weakened her to her breaking point. If could still stand after that, she didn't know if she could recover fast enough to stop whatever came next. Chetsney's world was pain. His body felt wrong. Never, in any of his battles, had he been struck so solid a blow. He could tell that there were things inside him that were absolutely broken. Things he didn't have names for. The strength inside him was swiftly leaving him. He didn't even know if he could move without breaking something else. Still, He closed his eyes and grit his teeth. What was he going to do when he was the last one standing, and his foe was right there in front of him? When everyone else was broken, and all that was left was him, would he lay down and die, because it hurt too much? Everyone in the magic school, the people of Rat Cirque, Kagudo, Jurain, he envisioned them all watching him, crying for him to stand up once more. Their only hope. It wasn't enough, until he thought of Midia, lying dead and broken, eyes, glassy and lifeless, her only chance if he stood and fought. He cried out, to brace himself, but through the pain it sounded more like a strangled cry. One knee came up. Then, he pushed himself up with everything he had left in his failing strength. Midia watched his rising unfold in horror and awe. She was caught between the twin worries of trying to muster the strength to put him down before he could fully recover, and being terrified he was getting himself killed for just a sparring session. Daphne clapped 3 times.
Okay, show's over. Take a break, get healed up, and then I have some comments for you both.
At once, the 2 of them collapsed to the ground, exhausted. An attendant ran over and fed them each a warm, salty green broth. It had an extremely strong taste of algae, but the curative effects were immediate and profound. Midia found her stamina was replenished almost instantly, and the wound at her side closed without the faintest scar. Chesney, on the other hand, felt his insides twist and wrench, and a few things snap into place painfully, crying out for a moment. When the pain subsided, he said,
Ow! 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 Wow, you, really got me with that last hit, Midia. Oh, Chesney, are you okay? What were you thinking, standing up after something like that? Do you not remember the several conversations we've had about taking stupid risks and almost getting ourselves killed?
She chided worriedly, kneeling beside him. After a few weak breaths, he said,
Honestly?
He waited to meet her eye and saw her nod. Quietly, he said,
I tried to feel how I would if I saw you dying in front of me, and I'd taken a blow just like that.
The wash of emotions she was plunged in were impossible to describe. A mixture of fear, and dread, and pride, and unworthiness, and awe. She had no idea how to respond to something that light, as if anyone would know what to say. She settled for giving him a hug, and said,
Don't scare me like that, okay, Chesney. Don't forget what you promised me, back in Denebra.
He reciprocated the hug, and nodded.
I'll do my best.
At last, they stood, and made their way over to Daphne, Destry, and Slayer. Chesney whispered to her, smirking.
That freeze at the start was just mean.
She laughed.
Don't blame me for forgetting you could even do it. And this coming from the guy who threw his sword at my legs as a very hard to ignore distraction. All right, you 2 okay? All ready to go?
Daphne said, looking them up and down and giving them her customary sour old hag eye over. At their nods, she continued,
All right, I saw some good work out there. You 2 are getting to be pretty good at fighting, but you need to be smart. Smarter than smart. You 2 are still kids, and that means you're always going to be at a disadvantage.
She looked to Chesney, one of her eyebrows sinking.
Chesney, you should have won that fight. You're bigger, stronger, and have more magic at your disposal than Midia does. Do you know why you lost? Because you were being fair. You had the time to strike a blow before she hit you with break, but you waited to see what she was going to do.
She then turned to Midia, with somehow even more of a disapproving glare.
And as for you, Midia, you're smart, but sometimes you think you're smarter than you really are. By giving him time to think, you're losing your advantage, even if you are trying to lure him into traps. If he had started with the defense down technique, that body check would have taken you out instantly. And that little race at the end? That was a 50-50 shot of success. If he had gone for a slide at your ankles, rather than dove in for a tackle like an idiot, you would have lost.
She sighed, and put hands on both their shoulders.
I know you think things have been hard up until now, and they have been. But when you get to Sasquatch, you will be completely on your own. No second chances. One mistake will end you both. You can't be fair, be smart, be mean. Get those artifacts at any cost. Do you understand? Good. And don't neglect your training. I want you two to spar more often.
Daphne leaned in even closer and whispered to them both.
One last thing. Mercenaries was a good idea. The more eyes watching your back, the better. You two have been pretty lucky so far, from what you've said, but don't take them for granted. The only two people you can trust are each other. Be selective. Use your heads. Be safe.
No pressure or anything, Chesney grumbled in his thoughts. Ooh. Not long after, they made ready to leave. When they had made their preparations in the cave, Destry asked,
So, where exactly do we have to go to get the sword again?
Daphne led them to another passage to the right of the cave wall.
You aren't getting anything. It's these two. And as for where you're going, it will be pretty obvious in a second. Lovely girl, this one,
he mumbled. She led them to another small cave. It was utterly ordinary, save for a strange device on the ground. A flat, glowing blue circle was on the ground, around which was a metal casing. The casing had some large cables jutting out of it, snaking along the floor to another large metal box that was thrumming loudly.
What's this thing?
Chesney shouted over the racket.
It will take you to the location in Nasquat very close to where you can find Cormu's sword. Now hurry up and stand on the pad. I can't keep that thing powered up forever.
They all followed suit, though Slayer seemed for the first time somewhat hesitant. He very gingerly tested it with an extended toe first, before finally stepping onto it. The hum began to get louder, and the glowing circle underneath them flashed faster. From the base, a series of rings floated up in the air and surrounded them, and also boxing them inside. A wind from nowhere began to pick up, blowing their clothes and hair about.
Wait!
Medea yelled over the incredible noise.
How will we get back here? And how do we get to Sasquatch?
Daphne tried to shout while fiddling with a device near the cave wall, but over the noise Medea couldn't hear the reply. All at once, a great light overtook them, and in the next instant they were outdoors.
What in the world?
Slayer gasped, staggering back and turning all about. They found themselves on a beach out in the bright daylight. Nearby, a group of startled birds squawked and flew off in surprise. The air was salty and warm, and a few hundred feet away to the south was the ocean, lapping up against the familiar sandy soil of Nasquat. Medea growled,
Ah, that woman. Does she have to be so insufferably vague all the time? Did anyone catch what she said at the end there?
Destry gave a full-bodied sigh, and said,
I believe, she said, you kids will figure it out.
Chesney shook his head.
Of course she did. Any idea where we are?
They all scanned the horizon in all directions.
Medea
said, after a time.
What's that?
Chesney asked, turning to her.
Well, nothing.
Chesney shrugged, and went back to his own observations. Eastward.
Huh.
Medea said, after another moment.
Okay, it's obviously something.
Chesney sighed, turning to her once again and crossing his arms.
Well, if you look way down to the southwest there, just over the lip of that mountain, can you see that little splash of pink?
He stood beside her, and looked.
Kinda. What about it? I could be wrong, but it really seems like it's that sky temple thing in Jerain.
He squinted.
You know what I think? What's that?
She asked, turning to him.
Why are we squinting into the horizon when we have a bloody map?
Oh, immortals. How did I forget we had a map? She thought glumly to herself as she slapped her forehead. They pulled it out, and all four gathered around to see.
Wow, this thing sure is fancy. Where did you get it?
Destry asked, leaning in close. Slayer seemed equally interested, though he was trying not to look it. Absently, Medea said,
"Oh, just in some deadly ghost-filled ruins."
In a moment, she tapped the screen.
There. I was right. And, more importantly, if we follow the natural direction of this landscape, we should find a town.
And so, they set off. Slayer stood in front and led the way. Medea and Chesney took the middle, while Destry volunteered to be rear guard. With Destry using his magic to keep the beasts away, it was making to be a very boring trip.
Sure you don't want to just take a detour for a bit and do some fishing instead?
Medea joked. Chesney grinned and said,
"Don't tempt me. I really do miss it."
Then he playfully grabbed her ponytail.
"I'm sure if I cut some of your hair and borrowed your staff, I could make a decent fishing rod." "You wouldn't dare."
She squealed and jumped to the side. Unfortunately, she happened to jump right onto a large rock and lost her balance. In the next instant, Destry was there and caught her expertly.
"Whoa there, young lady. You know, feet are supposed to stay on the ground." "See, I know on account of all the practice,"
he said, doing a little dance and spinning her back towards Chesney. Flustered, Medea just stammered out,
Thank you, Destry. Sorry for the trouble."
Falling down over something so silly would have been far too embarrassing. A few moments after they had resumed walking, in their positions, she whapped Chesney on the back of the head.
"Ow, what was that for?"
he groused.
"You know exactly what it was for, you big stupid lug. You better watch your own ponytail. Buster, thought I just might sneak over one night, and snip snip."
He protectively held the back of his head.
"See, come on now, it was all just a joke."
Not long after, Slayer pointed to the horizon, and they could see a town come into view. From a distance, not much could be made out, but it was pushed right up, and possibly over, the edge of a beach into the ocean, on a narrow strip of land to the northwest.
"She couldn't have landed us a little closer?"
Chesney huffed.
"Well, personally, I'm just glad we actually landed on solid ground. Assuming that device was ancient Reagan technology, it's incredibly old. I imagine the chances of it not working right have to be pretty high. What if we appeared in the ocean? Or hundreds of feet in the air?"
The thought of those two very real scenarios made Chesney shiver.
"Good point. I vote we avoid weird glowing pads in the future."
Soberly, she nodded.
"Agreed."
Their goal in sight, they increased their pace, and all conversations ended. As they got closer, they were able to see the town in greater detail. It was almost all wood and was a huge structure suspended over the water attached to wide wooden poles driven into the seabed. It gave the impression of a pier that had just grown and grown, with people building homes and shops and all manner of other things to it over time. Above all that, though, it was beyond gaudy. Every flat surface was painted with murals or festooned with streamers and flags and signs. It gave the impression that the whole town was just a big ongoing festival. Only, the party looked like it was long over, and nobody had wanted to clean up. On second glance, the murals were sun-bleached and flaking away. The streamers and flags and signs were torn, or askew, or fallen down. The entrance to the town was a wide, sturdy staircase leading up from the beach to the elevated walkways above, and above that was a huge sign as bright painted red.
"Welcome to Leyden, home of Dragon Mountain."
The calligraphy of the sign was elaborate, and all around it were little flourishes, and dominating it was a stylized red dragon breathing fire underneath it like an underline. Chesney began.
"It's so tacky."
Medea finished. Slayer shook his head.
"Thank Gabnid. I thought for sure it was just me."
They all expected a funny quip to come out of Destry's mouth just then, but none came. Chesney turned to look behind and see why, only to find the trio was alone.
"What the? Where are Destry?"
he said, turning this way and that. Medea looked concerned.
"He was just behind us, wasn't he?"
confused himself. Slayer turned and looked about as well. In a moment, his face paled.
Oh no. Destry, you absolute knob. You didn't. You wouldn't.
Chesney looked over at the slumping Lubot.
What do you mean? What's wrong?
He sighed resignedly.
I hope I'm wrong. Check your pockets.
With dawning realization, Chesney and Medea began patting themselves down. Chesney felt his pouch, filled with coin and some of the spirit crystals they had obtained, and it seemed fine. Medea, though, touched her pouch and gasped when she touched it, and it felt very light. Slayer closed his eyes and shook his head.
I'll kill him. That wretched bastard.
Frantically, Medea opened her pouch, only to find it empty save a rolled-up piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It was a note. Dear patrons, sorry, I really don't go in for all this saving the world stuff. If you were smart, you wouldn't either. Now that you've gotten to where you're going like I promised, I took a few extra fees for my trouble. Thank for your contribution to the Destry Philanthropist Foundation. Yours sincerely, Destry. P.S. Thanks a ton for landing us out in the middle of nowhere before I could run off. Jerks! At the bottom was a little doodle of Destry's head, winking and giving a peace sign. Chesney was stunned. He felt like someone had poured ice water down his back. It took all he had to hold in his anger. What kind of ghoul would rob not only a couple of children out on their own in the world, but also the only people who have even a chance of averting a disaster that affected the whole planet? What the hell were they even supposed to do? Turn around and go running all over trying to find him and take it back? As much as it pained him to see half their money disappear in an instant, he knew that wasn't an option. As much as he hated to admit it, they were stuck. There was no way to go but forward. But that feeling of betrayal? It wouldn't go away, no matter how much he tried to rationalize how pointless it was to dwell on it. That anger was burning up a hole inside him faster than he could put it out with reason. How long had he been planning this? From the start? He must have. 50 gold as his hiring fee? In retrospect, what else could it have been but a scam? Every smile, every quip, every word and deed that Destry had done was thrown into a new light, knowing that with everyone he had known, he was going to betray them and rob them. And what about Slayer? Destry had pulled him out of a crowd for them to hire alongside him. Could he even be trusted now? He seemed to be surprised by this, but obviously he was not the great judge of character he had thought until now. He was considering what to do next when he became aware that Medea, beside him, was breathing heavily. Her body was hunched over, gripping the letter in 2 tightening fists until it ripped in half from the tension. Her breathing was getting louder and harsher, while her body subtly trembled. Caught off guard, and more than little concerned, Chesney began,
Medea, are you?
but was interrupted when she screamed and threw the notes to the wind. There was a change to the air, something he couldn't initially put his finger on, a feeling of lightness and a strange smell, and a buzzing he couldn't place. He turned his head to follow the noise, only to see the metal pommel of his sword was buzzing because a tiny little spark was hovering over it. Then he realized the lightness was his hair beginning to stand on end. Oh, shit. Sudden realization dawned, and he looked over at Medea as her fists shook with rage, and arcs of lightning danced over her arms. A shadow passed over them, and Chesney looked above them to see a dark cloud forming with light flashing within, and the wind picking up. He thought a much more profane curse.
Slayer, get down, now!
He ran to the large man clad in heavy metal armor, and tackled him to the ground, covering him with his body.
Medea! Calm down.
But she could not hear him. Senseless and enraged, she screamed, and her body exploded in power. Lightning flashed from her to the cloud, and back again, and she began to levitate a few feet in their air while caught in the storm. Through the incredible noise of blast after blast of lightning raining down, Medea began to shout so loud, he was wondering if they might have been able to pick up a word or two in Ratzer. All he and Slayer could do was cower on the ground and wait for her to stop. Chesney had thought that Medea's cursing could be vulgar before, but this was a whole new level. She was absolutely mad with rage, and apparently that made her incredibly creative and colorful with her word choice, and downright cruelly imaginative with her threat. Slayer soon looked to be a few years older.
Things like that shouldn't come out of a little girl's mouth.
Another terrible scream, and somehow the storm intensified, and bolts of lightning descended over almost the whole of the peninsula. And somehow, she wasn't yet done. More threats, in long excruciating detail, on what she would do if she ever found him, and personal, lifelong vows of revenge. She had taken this extremely personally. Chesney was legitimately scared that she was going to fly off after him in this state. Slayer covered his mouth in horror.
Would she really do that? Break his legs and heal him to do it over again? And how does she know so much about Destry's mother?
Her final words echoed over the landscape. The storm dissipated as her screaming broke down into hiccuping sobs between gasps for breath. The static in the air was gone, and she fell to her knees and slumped over in the sand, shoulders shaking. Chesney scrambled beside her and wrapped his arms around her. Her face was twisted in anger, sadness, and shame. She tried to wipe away the tears and snot from her face, but it was pointless, so instead she covered her face and apologized between gasps.
I'm so sorry, Chesney. I was so stupid, and let him rob us. Rob me. He robbed me, because he thought I was the weak one. And it worked. I'm supposed to be responsible. I have to watch our backs. And I failed. That quick-fingered bastard. I know when he did it. When he caught me when I was falling over. I should have been so much more suspicious. I shouldn't have trusted anyone. Daphne even warned us. Warned me. Stupid. I'm so stupid. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Hey, none of that.
Chesney began, rocking a little back and forth.
This is absolutely not something for you to blame yourself over. That 100% could have been either one of us.
Medea was hardly mollified, but she allowed herself to be rocked nonetheless.
That's not true. Actually, I'm sure it would have been both of us, but even Destry had some standards. Think about it. He found out exactly what we needed, right when we needed it, then charged us a paltry fee to see where we kept our money, and had us lower our guards. Then it's just a matter of nicking the lot when we least expect and vanishing away. It would have been easy to grab both our pouches. I wasn't the least bit suspicious. But then he starts to get second thoughts, and only takes half, because we're kids. I'm sure, if we had been adults, he would have robbed us blind.
Bitterly, Medea whispered.
Great. We're so damn lucky, aren't we?
Chesney stood then and looked over at Slayer.
Well, how close am I, Slayer? What do you mean?
He stammered and took a step back. Chesney pointed a finger right in Slayer's face.
You, instantly, knew what he had done, because he's done it before.
Medea gasped in sudden understanding.
By Sophie's grace. Oh, Slayer, you knew?
Slayer's hands instantly went up in a defensive gesture.
Now, hold on. I didn't know. Exactly. I knew sometimes he could be a bit of a scoundrel, but I never imagined he'd rob a couple of kids. Not in a million years.
Chesney was undeterred and got right in Slayer's face.
Slayer, assuming I even believe you, don't you think, in your capacity as our bodyguard, it was, just maybe, your duty to inform us of the possible dangers of our traveling companion?
After a moment of abject embarrassment and soul-searching, Slayer's features collapsed.
Well, yes, I suppose I probably did.
Letting out a loud sigh, Chesney turned away.
Slayer, consider yourself fired.
Ashamed, Slayer nodded, picked up his pack, picked a direction, and started walking.
For what it's worth, I truly am sorry.
Immortals knew how he'd get back home, how either of them would. But just then, neither of the pair of them much cared. They watched him go until he was a small speck in the distance. Chesney helped Mitty off the ground.
How are you doing?
She seemed like a wilted flower.
I'm exhausted, honestly. Yeah, that's not surprising after all that. Okay, come on. Let's go find somewhere to sit down, maybe get something to eat.
Dejectedly, they proceeded up the stairs to Lagan. Not long after they mounted the stairs, a bored-looking Sanal boy leaning on one of the anchoring pillars happened to turn in their direction, do a double-take, and hurried over.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. You must be here to see Dragon Mountain, am I right? Of course I'm right. Everyone comes to Lagan to see Dragon Mountain. Well, back when they still came to Lagan. Anyway. Well?
Chesney began, but was immediately cut off by the boy who continued his spiel completely undaunted.
But why stop there? We got great food, a world-class spa, and souvenirs out the wazoo to take back home to Mom and Pops. There's tantalizing tours to shock and amaze you, and when you return, a relaxing resort to soothe and sedate you. Actually, if...
Mitty tried to interject, but was also steamrolled right over. All the while he spoke, he led them along the streets of town. The interior of the town had fared a bit better than the unkempt exterior. The signs and banners were mostly intact and bright, but the wide walkways were far too wide and made the town seem far emptier than it really was. Here and there were what he could only assume were Lafarie and Skuru tourists walking about. Scattered amongst them were a score of Sanal business owners and barkers, waiting around for one of the few tourists to come near enough to try to convince them to shop.
Now, I know you're excited to go see the sights and sounds of Lagan, but I always tell people when they come to town that where they should, truly, begin their tours with the taste of Lagan. What are you in mood for? Meat? Vegetarian. Maybe some imported Skuru delicacies. They're fresh and just came in today after being out of stock for so long. But who am I kidding? You're in Lagan. Everyone's looking for the freshest catch of the day.
With a gesture, the barker turned them, bewildered, to face a huge, extravagant storefront. The establishment was called the Dragon Mountain Cafe, and the exterior was a wooden mural carved to look like the whole front was the body of a red dragon, with the door serving as the mouth. In its claws were heaps of fish, and in the other were steaks and bowls of noodles.
Now, I'm going to leave you with my very good friends here at the cafe who will in turn take very good care of you. Remember the name Roddick if you need tips on the Lagan nightlife.
He winked at them both as he ushered them through the dragon's mouth before turning and almost instantly disappearing back to his post at the entrance of town. What was that all? Mitty started to say, but was again interrupted by a chipper woman's voice behind her.
Oh, that Roddy. He's such a character.
The voice belonged to a somewhat tallish Sanal girl who had not quite hit her 20s. Her hair was cotton candy pink, and the slim fins along her jawline accentuated her face beautifully. She wore a tight-fitting red t-shirt emblazoned with the logo of the cafe, and a long black skirt.
Hi there. Welcome to the Dragon Mountain Cafe. My name is Wild, and I'll be your server today.
Using a couple of menus to usher them along, she led them to a 4-person booth with comfortable cushioned seating. They sat down, and their hands were quickly filled with menus.
Our lunch service has just started, and the specials are per bird subs, Gubo noodle full bowls, and, of course, the world-famous Lagan Bosting fish fillet. I'll give you a moment to look over the menus, and I'll be right back to take your order.
Like a bubbly, smiling hurricane, the girl was there and gone again, leaving them struggling to catch up to the present. They were almost afraid to say anything else in case someone else interrupted them, but at last Chesney whispered,
What just happened?
Mitty took a deep breath, about to say something, when Wild appeared once more out of nowhere, to say,
Oh, I forgot to mention, as a special deal today, with the lunch special or any other meal over 15 gold, is a complimentary tour guide-led excursion to Dragon Mountain. Hope to see you there.
and she was gone again. Medea was gripping her fork in a tightening fist.
If I get interrupted again, I'm going to jam this fork into someone's leg.
Chesney grimaced, believing her. He made a mental note to keep a few feet away until she was in better spirits. Trying to improve the mood, he said,
Well, we wanted to sit down and get a bite, so I'd say overall it's been a success, right?
Eyes glowered over Medea's menu at him, but eventually they deflated, and she sighed tiredly.
Yeah, I suppose. I still feel awful about losing all that money. Especially now, because have you seen these prices? We could stay a week at that travel house by Hagudo for what this meal is going to cost us.
Looking over the options himself, he found that he agreed with her, but after the few weeks they'd had, he figured they'd earned a little treat.
Well, don't worry about that. Let's live a little. Plus, maybe our tour guide will have an idea about Cormu's sword.
Medea's eyebrow went up.
Oh really? We're taking this tour, are we? What was it she said? Hope to see you there. Wink, blow kiss, flutter away. Gag me, says the girl that practically drooled over Tiger and Dan.
Chesney countered.
Well, that's just, well, shut up.
She lightly kicked his shin.
Such comments are unbecoming of high-class adventurers such as ourselves. Ow.
Chesney was rubbing his sore shin when Wilde returned, chipper as ever. Chesney had the feeling that a stampede of ellipsaurs could be rampaging through town, and her expression would not have faltered in the least.
Hi there. So, have we had a chance to look at the menu? What can I get for you?
Sweetly, Medea said.
Well, I've had more than enough per bird to last a lifetime, and feeling a bit homesick, so I'll take the Gubo noodleful bowl. Oh, and a glass of milk, please. Lovely. And you, sir?
Making sure his shins weren't within kicking distance, Chesney turned his attention to Wilde and said,
I'll take the fish, please. Oh, and I'll get one of these wild berry smoothies, too. Ah, the world-famous lag-embossing fish fillet. Yes, that's the one. And the smoothie. Got it. I'll get those started right away for you two.
And off she went. They filled the time between Wilde appearances with Medea getting some of her mood back by asking him a dozen questions about life at the magic school. She seemed utterly fascinated by the subject and wanted to know everything, even the details Chesney had barely given a second thought to even when he lived there. When the food arrived, almost all of the conversation stopped, save for how incredibly good the food was. Medea practically melted in her chair.
Oh, Cormu, save me. I'm going to die. This food is so good. Do you know when the last time we've had a proper meal like this was?
Chesney, equally at peace with his own meal choice, replied,
I honestly think it was the big feast back in Ratzurk.
The fish was cooked in an acidic reduction that really brought out the flavor of the Bostane. He didn't want to admit it, but it might be even better than Mom's. Maybe that was just the hunger talking, though.
Ah, right. That was forever ago. Or it feels like it anyway. And I have difficulty remembering parts of that night. Well, everything you said to those two mercenaries is etched permanently into my brain, if you want a recap.
She slurped up a huge mouthful of noodles and replied in a muffled voice.
Those bastards deserved worse. Pretty sure now that you quadrupled the costs of their drinks, they probably paid to rebuild the town by now.
At last, they were stuffed. Every scrap of food was cleaned away. Chesney was idly eating the rest of the sauce with his finger when their waitress returned.
Did you enjoy the food?
She asked with her unflappably cheerful demeanor.
You can say that again.
Medea groaned.
It was so good I couldn't stop eating it. Wonderful. I'll bring the check.
When she returned and Chesney started counting out the money and tip, he asked,
Say, Wilde, you ever heard of the Sword of Cormu? We are kind of looking for information about it.
She raised her eyebrows and leaned in conspiratorially.
Well, you are in luck, because I think if you go on the complimentary tour, You might just learn a little bit about that. No spoilers, though. Interested?
Chesney grinned up at Wild.
Well, you sold me. Plus, I probably need to walk some of this off. Where do we go?
She explained that in about 15 minutes, everyone who was interested was to meet in front of the large painted dragon statue in the center of town. She took the money and tip, bowed, and left them to their day. When Chesney looked over to Medea, she had apparently been making sarcastic faces at him for the last several moments when nobody was paying her any attention. He sighed.
The depths of your maturity know no bounds.
Her eyebrows shot up, and she leaned over the table exaggeratedly, before tossing her hair over her shoulder and batting her eyelashes at him, then said,
Well, aren't you in luck?
Blushing, he led the giggling Medea out the restaurant and made their way to the center of town.
She was just being nice.
When they arrived at the large dragon statue, there was already a small crowd there. Laughing and screwed tourists, as well as a few sane locals, had gathered at the base of it, and more were wandering in all the time. Most were mothers and fathers with their children. Chesney looked on a bit wistfully.
Do you think your dad would want to come here when everything's all over?
Medea chuckled wryly.
Ha! Oh, no. He would absolutely hate this place. Though, I'd still like to bring him.
Her face grew wistful as well. They'd both been away from home for a long time now, and it felt like a lifetime ago. One of the tourists who was waiting looked them up and down, crossed her arms, and asked,
Are you two here alone? Where are your parents?
She was very tall, made even taller by a spectacular purple updo that was like an exploded mohawk. Her eyes were mature, perhaps a little severe, and her eyebrows were so long and thick they were frankly intimidating. Completely taken aback by the sudden question, they were struck too dumb to respond at first. They both said, looking at each other. Eventually, Chesney cleared his throat and said,
Yes, and there. Occupied.
The woman scoffed.
Goodness, how irresponsible of them. Well, nothing for it. I'll watch out for you. My name is Minma. If you need anything, just ask, okay? Yeah, sure. Thanks. Minma.
Medea managed, in as diplomatic a tone as she was capable. Any further discussion about the situation between them was interrupted by a loud series of claps and voice at the edge of the throng.
Okay, there everyone. My name is Wild, and I'll be your tour guide today on the Dragon Mountain tour.
Medea grumbled under her breath.
Of course. Why did I expect any different?
Wild had changed into another outfit. This time she wore a smart bright red Breton hat with a gold band, another tight t-shirt, and blue pants. The t-shirt was white and red. I was a tour guide for Dragon Mountain, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt.
A few rules to get out of the way first. Number 1. Always keep your eyes on me. I am the one with the little red cap, and do not lose sight of me, and listen to everything I say. 2. The hike to Dragon Mountain is not a short one, so please keep in mind that this is walking tour. If you cannot handle that, please do not join this tour because you will be left behind. 3. As we will be outside of town, there is the possibility, however slight, that monsters or other creatures native to this area will appear. In that event, stay together, listen to me, and I will protect you. Lastly, the city of Lagan and its tourism board make no guarantees for your safety or your belongings, and by agreeing to take this tour, you waive all legal rights to sue for compensatory damages. Now, with that out of the way, follow me. If there are any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
With that, Wild turned and led the throng of tourists, Chesney and Medea included, out of the city.
Oh, don't you worry, dearies. It's actually very safe.
Mina said close by, in a soothing voice.
Thanks. I'm sure everything will be fine,
Chesney said, politely. Privately, he turned to Medea and whispered,
Is she going to be like this the whole trip? How in the world to politely tell someone to buzz off? If she keeps on like this, she's going to find out real soon, and it's not going to be polite.
Medea grumbled, returning Chesney's exasperated look. As they walked, Wilde discussed landmarks and the history of Lagan. Apparently, the tourism trade had been active for thousands of years, off and on. Sometimes business would be booming, and at others the novelty would dry up and the town would focus more on fish exports. Apparently, very recently tourism had dropped substantially. Chesney was pretty sure what the cause was. Medea, being thoughtful, had checked in on him when the topic had come up, but he assured her that he was past letting it get to him, and he was happy to truly believe it now, too. Meenma was never very far out of sight, or rather, she never let them out of her sight for any length of time. She would sometimes try to engage with them from time to time, like a parent trying to keep their own children paying attention, and it was getting on their last nerve. As Dragon Mountain reared closer on the horizon, it indeed looked strange and worthy of note. He'd never quite seen a rock formation quite like it. It was about this time that Wilde began her spiel about the legends surrounding the mountain itself. With a sly grin in her voice, Wilde called out,
"Okay, everyone, who wants to hear the myth of the dragon?"
A bunch of children clapped and cheered excitedly. Meenma joined them, and cheered in Chesney and Medea's direction, seemingly encouraging them to join in. They ignored her and paid close attention to Wilde. They'd been promised some information about Cormu's sword, and they were eager to hear it.
Well, long ago, it said that a great evil dragon rampaged over all of Lennis, and this evil dragon had a name. It was Strabo. Strabo destroyed cities, burned whole fields of crops to the ground, even gobbled up whole families, children and all.
At this, she growled and turned to the closest child, who practically leapt into her father's arms. She continued, with a devilish grin,
It threatened the lives of all the peaceful people of the world. It was said that some of the immortals of Riga had evil intent and unleashed the terrible creature on the world. All hope seemed lost. But then, of course, appeared the great ancient hero, Cormu. The battle was fierce. No mortal would have lasted a second. But Cormu, he was protected from Strabo's claws by his great helm, protected from the creature's fire by his great armor, and with his great sword he smote the creature utterly.
As she spoke, she mimed dancing about with the sword, slicing and dodging and thrusting.
And so, when Cormu killed the terrible evil dragon Strabo, it is said that his body crashed down from the sky and into the ground just north of Lagan.
Here, she mimed with her hands a winged thing gliding through the air, and crashing into the ground, complete with sound effects.
Legend now says that the corpse of that dragon remains there still, having become what we now call Dragon Mountain.
A Laffery man put up his hand, and said,
"Oh, come on, is that really true?"
Sporting the most knowing smile yet, Wilde leaned close and spoke softly.
"Well, some say that an unnatural warm wind blows from the great cave, and, on top of that, those who were foolish enough to enter could hear a faint sound."
She leaned in close to the kids who were staring in rapt attention, while pumping her fist.
Thump, 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 roar.
At the children's delighted shrieks, Wilde laughed and returned to leading them to the mountain.
Is it all true? Who can say? Personally, I always say that seeing is believing. And now,
she said, flourishing them forward,
you may see for yourself.
The children all gasped in wonder and amazement. Even some of the adults cooed. They now stood at the base of a curious formation of stone. It was like a mountain, all sharp angles and flat greenish rock, almost as large as Denebra had been, but not quite. Small bushes and mosses grew over the ruddy soil, mostly covering the whole of it in a green. Surrounding were smaller mounds of dirt that could charitably be called a crater, if you looked at them the right way. Otherwise, it seemed they'd walked into yet another tourist trap. There were food stalls, toy sellers, and a line up to approach the great cave mouth. Their tour group began to mingle in the area and went about their business laughing and playing, while Chesney and Medea hung back. Chesney crossed his arms and leaned into her, asking,
"What's your take on all this? I think we've just wasted an afternoon. Come on, be serious."
She rolled her eyes.
"All right, well, assuming that Daphne didn't make a mistake and send us off course, it's obviously too much of a coincidence. We are looking for the sword, and we just happen across a legend like this. The only question is, how do we separate the useful information from the legend? Yes, we could spend all day trying to ask people what the legend means. Or, we could just go in the cave. Yes, or we could do that. I certainly haven't had enough time spelunking through caves on this adventure. How did I ever get along without caves until now? Goodness knows."
Chesney walked towards the back of the line.
"Your sarcasm is leaking again." "Not a clue what you mean. I'm being completely, 100% honest. I can't wait to see what brand new, cave-themed adventures are in store for us next. You know, instead of being a pest, you could actually use the time to read or something."
She smiled sweetly.
"And where would the fun in that be, dear Chesney? But finding, I'll be good."
And dug out the novel that Chesney had given her. About halfway through the line, they were surprisingly joined by Wild.
"So, what did you think of the tour?"
Caught off guard, Chesney laughed sheepishly and scratched the back of his head just to do something with his hand.
"Oh, well, hi. Really, I thought it was pretty lively and colorful. The sound effects were a nice touch."
She laughed.
"Yes, I do like to make it a little more exciting for the kids. Though, I have to say you two don't strike me as exactly the tourist type."
Medea closed her book and regarded their guide.
"Well, you're right about that. We weren't exactly interested in the legend for curiosity's sake alone." "Oh, and what does that mean?"
she asked, a curious lilt to her voice. Medea crossed her arms and looked at Wild thoughtfully before she answered, as though she was measuring how much to really say.
"Well, to put it bluntly, we're looking for Cormu's sword, the actual, physical relic, and we have it on pretty good authority it's somewhere nearby. Do you know anything about it?"
She gave Medea a look that seemed to say, "You can't be serious."
"Oh, come on. You don't really believe all that business about the Great Ones and slaying a dragon and all that, do you?"
Chesney joined in, saying ruefully,
"Well, I certainly believe the dragon part. So, what's in the cave then? I noticed nobody is going in."
Wild looked over.
"Oh, not really sure, to be honest. We've always been told to stay out and keep others out. Probably some creatures, or maybe a heat vent. The warm air from the cave really sets the mood, so they probably don't want to spoil the illusion for people."
Chesney made a non-committal sound. He had no idea how much of the legend of this mountain was true, but the story of a terrible dragon rampaging over Lennis, defeated by Cormu? That he believed. He had no idea if the cave was related in any way to his quest, but he felt a pull regardless. And even from this distance, the strange foul warm air from the cave was noticeable. Too many curiosities to ignore. Once they were next, Wild turned to them and said,
"Once you're done here, just wait by the food carts and we'll head back once I've gathered everyone." "Oh, no, don't worry about us. We're fine on our own,"
Medea said.
"Don't let us keep you."
Wild sighed and her expression took on an annoyed glare, like she was very used to arguing with stupid tourists.
"No, that's not how this works. I take you here, and bring you back. That's part of the whole thing, and I can't have anyone getting lost or hurt or it looks bad for the whole town." "Well, that's going to be a problem,"
Chesney said, while smirking at Medea, who smiled sweetly back at him.
"Because we're going inside. See ya!"
Medea giggled, and they both dashed past the staff member that was keeping the line orderly and ran into the cave.
Hey, wait. You can't go in there,"
the attendant called. Wild growled.
"Ugh, what a pain. You stay here. I'll go after them."
She ran into the cave mouth.
"Stop right there, you little brats. It's dangerous.
A few moments later, a tall, purple-haired Lafri woman ran up to the cave mouth, pushing past everyone in the line. Gasping for breath, she shouted,
I knew they needed someone to watch over them. And you, how could you let 2 young children go in there? Don't you know people could get hurt?
She pushed past the incredulous man and ran into the cave mouth herself.
Hey, I'm serious. Don't go into the damn cave,
he called, but it was useless. To himself, he grumbled,
Why do I bother? Nobody ever listens to me anyway. I need a new job.
Oh. The two of them quickly discovered that the cave was unlike any they had ever seen before. The walls were uniformly patterned with odd, noodly-looking formations and protrusions. The air was hot and fetid, like stepping into a swamp on a summer's day. The walls were also somewhat slimy, occasionally dripping a green sludge, though most of the cave was dry and brittle. Chesney cracked a pair of glowvines, and handed one to Medea while they jogged ahead of their peruser. Their eerie green light filled the cavern. He didn't want to be reliant on the spirit of fire for light, in case something happened, since they were so short-handed. As they jogged, they found the floor quite uneven, and the passage twisty and difficult to navigate, so much so that eventually they had no choice but to slow their pace. Not long after, they were joined by an extremely ticked-off Wild, half breathless from the chase.
You two are in so much trouble. You're coming with me. Turn around this instant.
She lunged to grab Chesney's arm, but he easily slapped her hand away.
Yeah, we're not doing that. Just go back.
Undeterred, Wild said.
You are not getting this. Look, I lied, okay? I said I didn't know anything about this cave so you wouldn't get curious about it. You want to know what's in here? Dangerous, gross creatures. Explorers used to come in here, and they'd all die. So we closed it off. Now let's go back before anyone gets hurt, okay? Please.
Medea rubbed her forehead in frustration.
I'm sorry, Wild, but we have to keep going. Why? What's so important you would risk your life over?
Chesney had had enough.
Your life. Their lives. Everyone's lives.
He growled and tossed his vine to the ground, turned to Wild, and gesticulated while he talked.
You want to know why I believe this whole dragon legend? Because it's happened again. Right now, there's an awful creature that's been unleashed upon Lennis, and we're tracking down the only possible means of stopping it. Okay, believe me or not, that's the truth. Kid, this isn't Fantasyland. We're not playing pretend right now.
She lunged at Chesney, but Medea's staff blocked her path.
You will not touch him,
Medea said, coldly.
And I'm not playing games.
She pulled her bow off her pack, and pointed it at Medea.
Turn. Back. Back. Now!
In an instant, Chesney's sword was pulled out and pointed at Wild's chest.
Don't make me.
The tense moment dragged on, with the three of them staring each other down in the dim bubble of light. All of them determined to do the right thing, reluctant to hurt the other, but not knowing what else could be said. The tension was broken when a wheezing, exasperated woman stumbled towards them out of the darkness and gasped.
All of you, put down those weapons. Don't you know people can get hurt that way?
Chesney and Medea both groaned loudly, sagging under the constant annoyance the woman had given them since their first meeting.
Sophie, give me strength,
Medea shouted, thumping past Wild and shouting at Mima.
Lady, you need to get lost. We didn't ask for your help, and we sure as hell don't need it.
A fire flared over their heads, and everyone ducked in surprise. Chesney cried out, pointing to a burnt but not yet dead blob that had been sneaking up on them from behind Mima.
Talk later. We have company.
The slimy walls came alive. Strange, translucent, gale-like creatures seemed to emerge from the smallest of crevices. The cave filled with odd, melodious piping as the strange creatures made their ululations. A group of creatures the color of wildberry jam, amoeba-like with waving tendrils, descended on Chesney and Wild. He slashed at one, and immediately the disgusting viscous fluid within seeped out, and the thing deflated like a balloon, dead on the ground. 2 more were on him and splashed him with a strong acid. More were all about his legs, restricting his movement. He couldn't stop the 2 that had splashed him from climbing onto him and trying to get underneath his armor. Wild was equally swarmed, but she was lightning quick with her bow. 2 went down with putrid, popping sounds as arrows pierced them, while another 3 were nicked and slowly began to ooze out plasm.
Get back out of the tunnel. I'll hold them off.
They both yelled at each other. Finally, Chesney yelled,
Whatever, just watch my back and pick off what you can. I'll try to keep them from getting past me.
At that, he ripped one of the amoebas off his smoking armor, and tossed it back into the darkness. The other, he scraped off with his sword. Then he squared up with the growing throng. Together, they slashed and shot, trying to endure until their enemy had spent their numbers. Meanwhile, behind them, Medea and Mima had been beset by a combination of strange, tough polypus things that were stuck strongly to the walls, and a horde of long, slimy leeches that were quick as a wildfire, crawling up their bodies and latching on to any exposed surface. They both screamed in terror at the things, Medea especially. The terror of the Haguro well was not forgotten, and seeing these new larger, faster leeches was like seeing her nightmares made real.
Freeze!
Mima shouted, and a score of the things were frozen in time and fell off harmlessly. In a rage, Medea unleashed a double blast of lightning that jumped easily between the groups of the slimy things, cooking many of them to the point of making them burst. The air was getting thick with spores. The strange polypus things were releasing them in hissing spurts. Medea tried to use her sword staff to cut one down, but to her amazement it pulled back and used its bulk to knock her down. Instantly, she was over him with a new batch of leeches, and she spun and kicked and thrashed to be free of them. Mima took out a thin blade from her sleeve and hacked at the stem of one of the polyps, but her vision was getting dark, and she couldn't stop coughing.
Chesney, help me,
Medea cried, unable to fight against the horde and too terrified to concentrate. She would yank one from her skin, and 2 more would slither in its place. He looked back and saw what was going on. His eyes widened, recognizing the all-too-familiar scene.
Everyone, get down. Blow up.
He thrust both hands into either side of the passage, and the air was filled with dozens of tiny explosions. The close quarters of the tunnels made it almost impossible to miss. 2 of the polyps snapped off and shriveled. The leeches covering Medea were blown away, and another score besides. The group of amoebas were crumpled as well, most of them now leaking, or already covered with the viscera of their fallen comrade. Chesney fell to his knees. That spell was still a huge toll on his body. He panted out,
Medea, Mima is poisoned. And Wild, take point while I catch my breath. She got it,
Medea said, rolling to her feet and rushing to Mima's side, while she swooned on the ground. Wild wordlessly stepped in front while Chesney took a pill, then another. She set aside her bow and yelled, Rake! A shockwave of distortion erupted from her hands, tearing the soft things into chunks as easily as if they were wet paper bags. Medea was beside Mima, pressing her hands to her chest and praying. Mima was engulfed in a pale blue light, and she could breathe more easily. Medea then fell back, applying the same magic to herself.
Dear, you look awful. Here, take this. Hold on. I'll get you out of here.
Mima handed her a pill from a bottle Medea hadn't seen before. She took it, and was instantly filled with an incredible amount of energy. Whatever it was, it had a real kick. Mima covered her face and stood well away as she unleashed bolt after bolt of lightning on the remaining 2 polyps, and stamping furiously into a pile of leech bodies that may or may not have been moving anymore. From her place on the ground, Medea had a perfect view as something new came out of the wall, directly above them. She tried to cry out, but it was too late. Disgusting tangles of brown ropes with vibrant red balls along the length poured down, coiling on all 4 of them. Mima screamed, but her scream was soon muffled by the thing enveloping her face. A moment later, she was frozen as if she was a statue. She jittered a bit and fell over. One by one, the others were similarly afflicted. Medea, newly revived in strength, and having seen them coming, was able to roll out of the way and jab her staff into the one that had been heading for her.
Chesney, Wild, Minma, what's wrong? What's happened to you?
She cried, but there was no response. Panicked, she rushed to each of them and used her staff to try to pry the things away. The few remaining amebas and leeches were rallying, and would be over them in moments. She felt Chesney's neck and still felt a weak pulse.
Okay. Think! Is it a neurotoxin?
She tried using her magic to purge poisons from the body, but there was no change. She had to kick away 2 leeches, while she pushed Chesney over and grabbed his bottle of anticetamol.
Please work, please work.
She shoved a pill inside his mouth, but again, no reaction.
No.
Their prone bodies were slowly being engulfed in the disgusting, crawling things of the cave. Then, she remembered. Earth, in combination with light, was an even more potent healing method. The healing powers of nature, enhanced with the precision of light, was able to cure conditions like mild brain injury, or nerve damage. Hoping, she pressed her hands again to Chesney and pushed the power of earth and light into him. Instantly, he gasped a huge breath, and moved to get up. He coughed.
Save them. I'll deal with the rest.
She rushed to Wild's side, brushing away the creatures trying to crawl over her, and gave her the healing magic. She too began to splutter and cough, and regain herself. Meanwhile, Chesney was cursing and roaring and slashing from one end of the passage to the other, stamping out everything he could. At last, she was able to save Minma. Minma, however, was absolutely terrified and insensible when she could move once more.
What was? How could? I can't. I'm sorry. I can't.
She staggered to her feet, an apology in her eyes in as equal a measure as fear. She backed away from them all, and ran back the way she had come. As annoying as the woman had been, she had tried to protect them. Medea just hoped that she would escape safely. This was not a place for her. It's not a place for me either, come to think of it. Her job done, she turned to find Chesney panting and pointing his sword everywhere, looking for what was next to come. She rushed past Wild, and touched his arm.
Chesney, it's okay. Calm down. They're all gone.
Chesney nodded, and braced himself against the cave wall, wheezing from the effort and the low quality of air. Medea let out a deep breath, and sat down against the wall opposite. All around them were slimy piles of bodies, casting gory shadows on the walls from the meager light of the glow vines still on the ground.
Sorry, Chesney. I froze up again. It was like I was back in the well,
she said, quietly, holding her knees.
When all the leeches came out, I completely panicked.
He chuckled softly.
And yet again, you completely gloss over the fact that you saved everyone's lives. You're not a burden, Medea. Did you ever think to blame me when I was freaking out in the Temple of Raya? No, of course not. Anyone would. Exactly. So, please, extend yourself the same courtesy. Don't think for a second I wouldn't have panicked if I was dying on the floor covered in leeches. Gah, so gross. All I could think to do was just blow up everything, as dangerous as that was for me. I'm just glad it worked out.
Cautiously, Wild joined them, crossing her arms and looking at them coolly.
You're really not joking, huh?
Chesney shook his head.
No, we're not. It's a really long story, but the short version is, there's another monster out there, only this time we don't have Cormu. So, we are trying to track down his weapons and armor to stand a chance.
Medea finished off the story.
Well, we spoke to that famous spiritualist Daphne. She had tracked down all of Cormu's items, and according to her, his sword should be nearby. That's why we entered the very gross, deadly cave. It seemed like the logical place to search.
Wild started combing out the debris from her cotton candy hair with her fingers, and generally setting herself to rights.
Well, that settles it. My curiosity is piqued. If all this legend mumbo-jumbo is real, I want to see it for myself. I'm coming with you.
Chesney pushed away from the wall, and his face went through several different expressions, like he couldn't think of exactly how he wanted to say something. Finally, he gave up and looked towards Medea.
I don't know. What do you think?
Medea tiredly raised her hands up in the air.
Whatever, at this point. Fine. Welcome aboard. No complaining about risking your life, though. You asked for this.
Beaming, she did a little fist pump.
You won't regret it. Plus, with me with you, technically you're not breaking any rules and this is all part of an extended tour. When we get out of here, though, you gotta tell me the whole story.
They all started walking into the deeper parts of the cave. Medea smirked.
I'm looking forward to how you describe what happened in Jerain. A certain someone was not a happy camper.
Chesney stuck out his tongue at her.
And I can't wait to explain our little trip to the neighbor mountain. A certain someone was very excitable.
Wild chuckled.
You two have been all over? Man, I'm so jealous. All I've really ever done is live and work in Login. It must be so freeing to be able to go and explore Lennis all on your own. Yes, it is. But, at the same time, freedom also means the freedom to make mistakes and face the consequences.
Medea said.
We've almost died countless times. Kidnapped, beaten, drowned, eaten, burned, poisoned, stabbed. You forgot haunted.
Wild's face was getting paler at the mention of all the ways they had almost met their end. But when they said, haunted, she got very curious and excited again. The girls began to talk and gossip about ghosts, which turned into a discussion about stories, which they talked about at length. Leading, Chesney didn't mind. Listening was soothing. It was something to dull the boredom while he kept out an eye for another ambush. His hand went up.
Hold on, something's wrong.
Everyone stopped and listened. There was no sound.
I don't hear anything?
Medea said, completely still. Wild nodded in agreement. He stepped near the wall of the cave.
Look at this.
Where he gestured was a thick green slime slowly oozing from the wall. He checked the ceiling, floor, and other wall. More was pouring out. It wasn't acidic, nor did it seem to be more of the creatures. Still, it was very concerning.
Let's go back, for now.
He ran past them to guard the front, but the pooling slime underneath him was slippery. He fell to the ground in a great squish, and a wave of slime knocked the other two down around him.
Off. Gross.
Wild said, trying to get up again.
This was my favorite tour shirt.
When one tried to get up, the squirming of the others sent them back down again. Medea growled.
Oh, Medea, what adventures did you have out in the world? Oh, Dad, it was great. There were so many caves, and there was this slimy one too. What fun!
While they were all busy trying to stand, it quickly became apparent that the level of the slime was rising, and even pushing them further into the cave. Chesney tried bracing against the wall to stop their descent, but it was useless. The slime pushed them down, and around tight corners, like a gigantic, disgusting slide.
Hey, there's a light ahead. I think it's outside.
Straight ahead of them now was what appeared to be the exit to the cave. The bright light of the outdoors a very welcome sight. In a moment they were dumped unceremoniously out onto the ground in a great slimy tangle of limbs, sliding for several feet on the viscous sludge. They all took a moment to get their bearings, untangle themselves, and stand without falling back over. They appeared to be in a clearing of some sort, penned in on one side by the cave mouth, and the tall mound of earth that seemed to make up part of the surrounding crater walls, and the ocean.
You know, I expected this whole adventuring business to somehow be a lot more glamorous.
Wild said, sighing as she tried to wipe all the slime away. The pair of them exasperatedly tried to do the same. Medea said, You're
telling me? Yeah. It's not like it sounds in the books, that's for sure. But wow, not only was this a huge waste of time, but we got disgustingly messy.
Suddenly, a booming voice began to speak.
I thought it was just an upset stomach, but looks like I coughed up something interesting today.
The voice laughed then, and the sheer power of that voice almost knocked them to the ground once more. They all turned in a flash towards the noise. When they had been shot out of the cave by the slime, no one had taken the time to take more than a cursory glance at where they were. Now, they turned to find that the cave was moving. Wild fell to her knees. The cave wasn't just moving. It was rising, talking. Part of the mountain shook, and huge clumps of dirt and bushes and lichens fell away to reveal a massive red-orange dragon's head. It had 2 sets of keen, very clever-looking yellow-slitted eyes swimming in a blood-red sclera. Its scales were pale and sun-bleached where the dirt had not well covered, but the rest were still vibrant, almost polished. Its long snout, the size of a house, no, a mansion, was filled with hundreds of sharp fangs. The crown of his head was covered in 5 towering swept-back spikes, and between them, his thick armored flesh flared out in display. It was looking at them now, a languid look of amusement, if such a thing could be discerned, on its face.
Are you real? Are you Strabo?
Wild gasped, too terrified to react or move.
I am. And I am,
he said. His voice was as great as the sea. This was no lie, no trickery. An impossible creature of legend was truly before them. Looking back on her time as a tour guide, she could do naught but shiver, knowing that the legends were true, and that she had visited this place countless times and been so close to this monster. In a terrified whisper, she could only ask,
"Are you going to eat me?" "I have just finished uneating you. Actually, stand up, child. Do not be afraid. I am indeed the Strabo of legend, but my heart is no longer filled with malice."
His eyes fell upon Chadzny and Medea, paralyzed with fear of their own. Or perhaps it was simply surprise.
"You two,"
it began, almost in a growl, but softer. There was something to his voice that spoke of strong emotion, but what great emotion such a creature could contain was something they could not fully relate to. It sounded so terribly weary, though.
"I've waited 10,000 years for you. Long, miserable years as the sun seared my body, and the people of Lennis had all but forgotten me. But, at long, long last, you've come."
And then, in a sudden burst of energy and rage, he cried into the heavens,
"Hear me, O Gabnid, O Great One! Pa! Long have I suffered through the torment that you visited upon me. Because of you, the only meaning of my existence was naught but suffering. May your name be forever cursed."
At last, the great dragon settled, and continued, much softer,
"But that is all in the past. You, great heroes, have finally come to release me. O great heroes, withdraw the sword that sticks in my back, the sword of Cormu that binds me."
It wasn't until he said how he was bound that it truly became apparent that he was. All his great movements were naught but tiny shifts when compared to his great size. And his size was great. Strabo was the size of a mountain, and all he could do to move was shift enough to dislodge the dirt that caked his skin, and crane his neck and speak. A dozen questions raced through Chadzny's mind. How was Strabo alive after all this time? What had Gabnid had to do with Strabo? Why didn't Cormu kill the dragon outright? How had the dragon known they were coming? And, most importantly, if he took the sword out, what would happen next? Would the world be terrorized once more? But, quick thinker that she was, Medea was the first to ask, though her voice trembled.
If we do pull the sword out, what then? Will you rampage over Lennis once more?"
The dragon laughed, a booming noise that felt like it could be felt around the world.
"No, child. The malice and rage that fueled my heart has long been soothed by time. And, more to the point, it seems you have little choice." "What do you mean?"
Chadzny asked, trying to stand brave beside her, which was hard. You had just been spat out like a ball of phlegm.
I can only assume you are here because you have need of the sword.
The monster had them there. The two looked at each other. Indecision and worry etched on their faces. Quietly, they spoke. Chesney asked Medea,
What do you think? Can we trust him? Under any other circumstance, I'd say no, but he's written that we don't really have a choice.
She bit her lip, pensive.
All we can really hope is that Daphne knew this when she sent us here. But it's up to you, Chesney.
He thought. All a swirling jumble of worries. But at the last, one clear thought solidified in his mind. That sword was pierced into Strabo's back, which meant it will work. It truly was capable of defeating the monster he was chasing, and he would chase it and destroy it, just as Cormu had done to this one, hopefully more completely, though. Wordlessly, he strode forward. Strabo lowered his head, making a path for him to ascend. Medea, scared but determined, and wild, terrified but also filled with awe, followed behind. The dragon's head had many spikes which made for excellent handholds. The scales under their feet welt like warm metal. Smooth, strong, impenetrable. But now that he was closer, Chesney could see deep gouges of some past terrible battle. Scorch marks, chipped or missing scales, deep gashes, even melted skin. It felt so alien, standing here, so close to history. The Tower of Gabnid was ancient, but it never featured in the stories. Here, with Strabo, it was almost like he could feel the weight of history, that the passage of years felt so much shorter than it truly was. That feeling grew even more intense when they had climbed up higher, high enough to see all around the region, and there stood the most sought-after ancient artifact in Lenis's history. Cormu's sword. He had never seen its like before. Its handle was the blue of the sea, with a very familiar symbol in it right by the hilt, a single teardrop. The shape of the handle and hilt was almost organic, with a rounded, lifelike design almost like decorated bone. The blade, if it could even be called such a thing, was a shining thing. The metal was white, so that it seemed almost like carefully blown glass, but the edges of it were indistinct, like it was constantly moving or vibrating or shifting. And from the pommel, to the handle, and into the hilt, thin pulsing lines of light, like circuitry, the same as he had seen in the tower, the same on the backside of Sophie's crown, and now, here, in the sword. Magic? Technology? Was there a difference to the immortals of Raga? For the first time in Chesney's life, he felt blasphemy. To see something like this was an incredible gift. To touch it? Sacrilege. To take it? Unforgivable. He couldn't shake the feeling that pulling that sword free would curse him, and mean the doom of the world, just as much as it was the first step in saving it.
Young man, you were able to activate that damn machine. Do you think in 10,000 years, nobody has snuck in and tried that panel? And Medea, do you think that crown works for just anybody? I don't know everything, but I have a strong hunch that those items are only going to work for you. Chesney.
His hand trembled over the grip of the sword, not daring yet to touch. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide. Like the fate of the world was hanging in the balance of this last chance, this last decision. This was real now, far too real. Cormu. The actual Cormu's actual sword was here. He wanted to look back at them, look at Wild, and Medea. But he was also so afraid to see any doubt on their faces. If there was even a hint of doubt in Medea's eyes, it would destroy him. He couldn't risk the look, he didn't dare. He could not show them his doubt, either. His hand shot forward. He gripped the handle firmly. This is the most powerful weapon on the whole planet. I don't know how to be worthy of it, but I will try. Please, great ones, help me. He pulled it free. The world moved beneath them.
Ah! 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 I can move again. I am free.
The mountain beneath them became alive, and began to shift, unravel, uncoil. They rose into the air as Strabo took great breaths. The long lengths of his body, it was like there was no end to them as they uncoiled and slithered from their eons-long slumber. The great laughter of the serpent was incredible. It vibrated the air in Chetsney's lungs, the very bones of his body.
Ha ha! At long last, I am free! Thank you, heroes! I am free! I see it now, see all. Time is broken. What an interesting fate this is! Ah ha ha ha!
Great orange wings spread out, so great that they covered the ground for a great distance in shadow. All three of them tried to stay on Strabo's back by holding on to one of the many large spikes along his crown. Wild seemed equally thrilled and terrified. Medea shouted to be heard over the noise.
Did we do the right thing? He isn't making any sense.
Chesney shook his head.
Who can say? He's lived for so long, who knows? But I think everything will be fine.
Wild shouted excitedly.
Well, he seems very happy at least. He probably won't eat us.
The great wings finished unfurling and snapped downwards, blowing a terrific gale of wind over the whole country. Medea hoped that Lagan was far enough away that nothing would be blown over.
Ah, the feel of the wind. How I missed you.
Strabo's voice was laced with deep satisfaction and almost mad revelry.
Let us take to the sky.
His wings began to flap faster and faster in his jubilation.
Where shall we go, brave heroes?
He cried, almost lost to his great joy.
North? South? East? West? To the sea? To the mountains? Shall we go to Riga, the land of the heavens? Or shall we go to the shining star, so, and dip our wings in its flame?
The flapping of wings was reaching a fever pitch. If they didn't go soon, Chesney was sure the whole of the lands around them would be swept down to bedrock.
Sasquatch, we must find the rest of Cormu's things. His armor and helmet. Take us to Sasquatch, Strabo. Then so shall it be. Let us be off into the sky, at last. Hang on tight, little ones.
One last great shove, and Strabo was airborne, with the trio of them clinging to his scales like miserable fleas in a hurricane. Strabo's incredible strength was such that it almost felt like he had pushed the world away from him, rather than himself from the world. At such scales, who could tell? In an instant, they were high into the air, higher still than Tiger could have ever hoped to soar. At first, they all huddled down for their lives, but soon the greatest effort of flapping had abated, and for a time, they soared evenly in the frigid upper atmosphere. Chesney dared to stand, dared to look, and was humbled by what he saw. It was as if the whole of Nasquat was laid before him. It almost felt like he could hold the whole world in his hands.
Medea. Wild. Come look at this. It's beautiful. It's amazing. I can't begin to describe it.
Slowly, very slowly, they pushed themselves to their feet and took a look at the world around them. Wild, cautious at first, soon became very excited and shouted her amazement.
This is incredible. Do you know what this means? We're like the first people on Lenus to ride a dragon. We're the only people ever to have seen something like this. Ha ha ha.
Medea's eyes were filling with tears, though she smiled very sweetly.
It's just so. I don't even know how to describe it. Like, I feel so gifted to see this, but at the same time, like I'm really just now seeing everything we're fighting for.
He stood next to her, and she took his arm to stay steady.
I know exactly what you mean.
Strabo's form was equally incredible and beautiful. Along his back were two incredible bone-like formations that seemed to cradle where his wings would be. But they were also very aerodynamic and intricate. Formations of bone and wings he'd never seen before. Strabo was truly unique. His great leathery wings were in fact brilliant yellow-gold in color, with large red spots. And underneath even that was a second set of wings. This set was clear and membranous, almost insect-like. How it had survived the eons intact, Chesney had no idea. Everything was awe-inspiring, overwhelming. The world below, he could look out and spot all the places they had gone. Dubur, Jurain, Hagudo Volcano, Even the Skuru camp was still there. Ratsirk, and the magic school as well, hollow and broken. And if he strained, he wondered if he could see north far enough to find his hometown of Rayold. The world below was a painting of color. The bright yellow sandy soil of the plains, the shimmering blue forests, the emerald green of the mountain cliffsides. There was nothing more he could say. Soon, they passed back over the southern edge of the continent. They could see the small cave in which Daphne had met them. He wondered if she could see them now. Next, the great ocean spread before them. These seas were apparently especially deadly and hard to cross. Just a bit to the west, he could see a dark thin line on the horizon.
"What's that?"
he asked, turning to the others. The girls looked as well, and Wild said,
"Oh, that's the rope network that connects the two continents. I hear it's been non-operational for a while now, but when it was operational, that's how the majority of travel and commerce between Nasquat and Sasquat happened."
"Well, at least there is supposed to be a way back." Just then, they passed above a curious, uniform, circular structure of stone, or perhaps masonry. It was massive, and seemed natural and unnatural at the same time.
"What is that?"
Medea stood beside him and looked.
"Ah, that's the throne of the immortals." "Really? That's where they arrived on Linus? Right in the middle like that?"
She nodded.
"Yeah, apparently they wanted to be sure that neither continent felt favored, and the people of both continents constructed the throne of the immortals to celebrate and revere them."
They flew over it too fast to get any better look. He so desperately wanted to know what was in a place like that, but it was impossible right now, especially since he was quite sure it was under Sasquatch control. Soon, to the south, a new dark shape emerged on the horizon. The landmass of Sasquatch was coming into view, and it looked so much different than Nasquat, so alien. The soil was dark and muted, almost ash-like, and the mountains were instead an intense purple. The familiar fields of forests and grasses were gone, replaced with sooty rock formations and tiny red splotches of color smeared here and there amongst the ashy soil. They began to descend, though the descent was rather rocky and bumpy. Medea called out,
"Is everything okay, Strabo?"
The dragon didn't respond. They hadn't noticed until just then, but Strabo was looking noticeably paler, and his neck and tail were sagging.
Medea, I think he's dying."
Chesney gasped, looking at Cormu's sword. Had the sword kept him on the brink of death for those 10,000 years, but not let him pass on? Or had he simply weakened over time? He couldn't know, and he didn't want to know. Either thought was so sad in its own way.
"Hold on, everyone!"
With a final great heave, Strabo cleared the northernmost cliff of Sasquatch and plowed deeply into the ashy soil with a great crash. The trio clung to him, for to be flung away at that moment would be deadly. At last, the great beast slowed to a stop, and he lay near motionless on the ground, breathing shallowly. They hurried off of him and ran to his head. Strabo's great eyes were half-lidded, and barely turned to regard them. Something strange was happening to his body, but it was unclear as yet what was going on. Weak though he was, his voice was still as great as an ocean when he spoke.
"We have arrived, great ones. This is Sasquatch, as promised. It is a land stained red with spilled blood and dark souls. And do not forget, be on your guard as you walk here."
He somehow seemed to sag, then, his body drooping.
"Now, my part is done. Finally, I can rest. After fulfilling my destiny, I can return from whence I came. But I am happy. I felt the wind one last time."
To their shock and horror, his body was beginning to boil and dissolve before their eyes, boiling and folding in upon itself, turning to liquid. Still, before at last his energy gave out, he opened his great eyes wide and saw them clearly, and roared.
"Fare thee well, brave warriors."
It was hard to know how to feel, as they watched his body boil away, dissolve, and melt into a great shining pool of glowing liquid. He was a being of terror who once tried to destroy Linus. But when they found him, his heart had calmed, and he used the last ounce of his life to help them on their journey. What could you say to such an ancient being like that? Thanks seemed so completely inadequate to the suffering he had endured, and the life he had given up in their service. Another thought drove into Cheese's mind like a burr that he could not loose. Knowing that Kaymat was so much like this being filled Chesney with a new sense of dread. He had never truly gotten a perfect look at Kaymat, but how could such a thing be killed at all? How had Cormu single-handedly done it? The sword in his hand, the only thing on the planet capable of destroying Kaymat and Dahlgren, was heavy like an anchor. The dark, forbidding atmosphere of Sasquatch pressed in on him, and he felt suddenly and keenly aware that he was in enemy territory. There was no way back, only forwards. He stashed the sword he had been using and slid Cormu's sword into the scabbard. Beside him, Midia's face was unreadable. Before, he would have left her to her peace. But now, after all they'd been through together, he would not let her be alone.
What are you thinking?
She met his eyes, then turned to look at the pool of shining blue.
I just feel small. Like, there's so much left to do, and for all I've done, I'm still just a little girl. How are you holding up?
He nodded in understanding.
I look at that sword, and I feel a weight pressing down on me. That there's no way I could ever be worthy of it. And even though it's lasted until now, I worry that any small thing I do could break it and doom us all. Don't be such babies. We just rode a dragon,
Wild said, forcing every bit of cheer into her face and voice that she could and grabbing them both into an embrace.
We just rode a dragon, and we have Cormu's sword. Plus, you two are actually kinda scary when you want to be. And I'm guessing you know where to go next, right?
They shrugged.
Well, more or less. Exactly. So let's go out there, kick some ass, steal some artifacts, and save the world.
Midia began to giggle.
Wild. You're so crazy. Alright, fine. I'm in.
She thrust her fist in the air.
Nasquad heroes.
Chesney and Wild followed suit, grinning like silly children. Chesney grinned at Wild.
So, no regrets following us, then?
She twirled and jumped with delight.
Are you kidding? This is amazing. Do you know how much I've longed to leave that tourist trap and see the world? To do something with my life? My old man's going to flip when he hears all about my adventures and—
She slapped her hand over her mouth, eyes wide. Then she started quietly giggling.
Oh, immortals, he's going to think I was eaten by the dragon. He's going to kill me when I show up.
Then she barked a laugh.
Oh, and what will everyone do now that Dragon Mountain is gone? I guess it's back to fishing. Who knows?
Midia said slyly, joining beside her as they began to walk.
We could find another dragon and crash it there. Oh, you cheeky thing.
They passed the time walking, telling Wild all their adventures, and thrilling in her reactions to them. It was nice to get a little recognition for a change. The day had been long. Confusing, thrilling, disappointing, deadly, and awe-inspiring. The path ahead was unknown, and sure to be filled with danger. But they had already fulfilled a third of what they needed on their journey, and their new companion was hard to feel melancholy around. Whatever was next for them, they would be ready. For a change, they looked forward to tomorrow.